Thank you. Welcome. What a great turnout this evening. Want to thank the library for hosting this event. It's something they do on a very regular basis for a lot of groups in town. I actually went on last week to confirm the time to start this, and the number caught my eye. It was 1,500, and it related to the library hosting 1,500 events a year. I went to the calendar and between adults and kids and teens and everything else. What a great resource we have here. It's nice to take advantage of. Tonight we have a panel discussion with regard to sea level, and it's rising. We'll talk a little bit about storm surges and record rainfall, all things that are very much on the minds of a lot of people here tonight. I'm John O'Brien. I'm a trustee at the Darien Land Trust, and we are co-sponsors of the event with the Save the Sound group, our friends at Save the Sound. Some might ask why the Land Trust would be sponsoring such an event having to do with sea, but if you take a look at our properties, more than 50% of them are either coastal, marshland, ponds, streams or rivers running through them, and a lot of what we speak about every month at our meetings has to do with those properties because they're changing. You know, a meadow will sit there, and we have to take care of that. But there's a lot of things going on with water, and of course, all these pieces of waterways are running down to Long Island Sound, and that creates a very important dynamic. We're here with the Save the Sound group, friends that we've done a lot with. Recently, of note, we're at a one-year anniversary point for something that some of you might be aware of, but there was a project that was completed after 7 years of permitting and funding and construction called the Norotan River Fish Project. And the Norotan River, for those who may not know, basically it creates the borderline between Stamford and Darien, emptying at Giovanni's. For the last 70 years, migratory fish have not been able to access the fresh water up the Norotan River because of the construction of 95 and the culverts that were created. Through a lot of hard work between the Save the Sound group and ourselves and the state, this was completed last year, and in fact, just after it was completed, 400 alewives were deposited in the pond at Olson Woods. Olson Woods is one of our properties. It's off of Hoyt Street. It's about halfway up the river, and the hope is that their offspring will be coming back and also spawning in that area. It'll be repeated again this month. We don't know the timing of it. We'll put out it's very interesting to watch, by the way. There's probably had about 20 or 30 people there last year. We don't know when our volunteer alewives will become available, but we'll have a couple of days notice, and we'll probably put it out on Instagram and the website, and invite everyone to come. By the way, Olson Woods is one of our properties. It's a 13-acre parcel that is open to the public, has a wonderful trail system around the pond, along the river. In fact, it abuts a property that we were deeded 2 years ago, which is another 3 acres. And for anyone who hasn't been, it's worth the trip. It's very peaceful, a lot of habitat, and a nice place to spend some time. As I said, it's one of the projects we've done with people at our friends at Save the Sound. Kurt Johnson is going to be introducing the panel this evening. Kurt's been, for those who don't know, at Save the Sound for 25 years or so, lending his legal expertise initially and having a few positions, including program director and executive director, and now the president of it. So I'll give it to Kurt to introduce the panel. One last thing, I want to thank our outreach committee at Darien Land Trust for all the work that they've done, putting this together, working with the group at Save the Sound. It takes a lot of work to put something like this together. And two of our chairmen are here tonight, Amy Sobransky and Sean Braga. Why don't you stand up and get some recognition?
Thank you, John. Just a couple things to get started. Could everybody turn off their cell phones if you haven't already? And the way it's going to work tonight is we're going to have an opportunity for each of the panelists to give a short presentation. I will ask a few questions. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions. If you're interested in asking questions, Joseph DiMaggio from our office is here. He has pads, and so just raise your hand if you're interested in doing that. I'm just going to, again, could the folks who were involved in the library just stand up? Because I think we should recognize them for just making this event possible. So, and all the land trust people, if you could also just stand up for a minute. I just want to, Flip and your whole crew, I just want to say that the Project, I want to first thank all of you for your patience on the Nerova project. It was a 7-year gestation process, longer than a blue whale. And Flip in particular spent hours on the phone with us and was a terrific, polite, and very well-educated badger of both ourselves and the DEEP. But it was a terrific project. If you haven't had a chance to see it, please come and see these animals being released. What you'll see is a cycle that's been going on for probably at least 50, maybe 10,000, 12,000 years, right? I mean, our rivers used to be black with these fish. And I know it's slipstream to have it black again on the river. And we'll get there. We'll get there, little by little. So thank you all from the Land Trust. I'm now going to introduce the panelists very, very briefly. We'll start with Jim O'Donnell, who I've known for years. Jim has been the head of what is called the Science and Technical Advisory Committee for our Long Island Sound National Estuary Program, which means he's fairly smart, even though he's from Scotland. So he runs a group called CIRCA, which Rebecca actually used to work at, but it's a very unique institute in the country. We are one of the only states, maybe the only state, that has an institute that's really focused on, resiliency, coastal resiliency. How do we respond as a state? And Jim heads that up. And if you are really interested in Long Island Sound buoy monitoring systems, I suggest you put aside about a month to talk to Jim, because he will talk to you for about a month about this institute. So I'm just teasing you a little bit.
Not tonight.
Not tonight, no. Not tonight.
I'm busy.
Rebecca, again, used to work at CIRCA. She's now the director of, Rebecca French, Director of National Disaster Resilience and Rebuild by Design for the Connecticut Department of Housing. We're very fortunate in the state that Rebecca and team were able to apply for, receive federal dollars. There's a major project going on in Bridgeport that she will tell you all about. And David Settleman, I may even have known longer than Jim. David is the Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy. He has done a terrific job for the past 2 decades of the Capitol, and is going to give you a really good overview, I think, of what's happening on the state level. I think that's a key point that I just want to raise before we go any further, that things are a little stuck in Washington when it comes to these issues. However, having said that, we've been able to increase Long Island Sound funding threefold during the time of a president who wanted to zero it out. So we're having a little bit of success. But there's so much activity that goes on up at the state level, and Connecticut has the possibility, needs to continue being a leader, both in fighting climate change, but also resiliency on Long Island Sound. So with that, each panelist is going to have 3 to 5 minutes for a short presentation. We're going to start with Jim O'Donnell. So thank you very much, Jim, for being here tonight.
Thank you. So I'm hoping there's some slides here.
Yeah, on the bottom, just look for your.
Oh, well, I did look. There we go. So now I gotta do this.
F5.
Okay. Okay, thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. Thanks for all of you for coming. There has been sort of a few steps backwards on climate and environment issues in the nation over the last 4 years. But I'm sanguine about the future, especially since so many people who care about it show up at things like this and they vote and they advocate for more wiser decisions. So tonight I don't want to talk about politics. My role here is to try and educate you about science. And I'm a professor of marine sciences and physics at the University of Connecticut. I've been there for over 30 years, and I've been running this environmental monitoring thing in Long Island Sound for about a decade. And for the last few years, I've been working mostly on sea level rise. And these are things that people really care about, I think, and it's really one of the most important challenges the state's going to face in the coming few years. And I'll try and illustrate why I say that now, and why it is Connecticut's kind of special. And I want to start about 10,000 years ago, just to give you a little primer for why Connecticut is special. This map here shows in green an area that was a lake 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last glaciation. And these red lines are rocky moraines that formed a dam that separated Long Island Sound, what is now Long Island Sound, but then it was called Lake Connecticut by geologists. There probably weren't very many humans around at the time here, but there could have been. And anyway, this lake extended all across Long Island. There was another one that was in Rhode Island and a few other places. And the sea level at this time was about 200 meters below what it is now. So all of this area, which is now water, was probably grassland. Maybe trees. And a river ran out of here across the shelf and into the ocean. And about 10,000 years ago, maybe 11, maybe 9, this sea level rose enough that tidal forces began to erode this rocky outcrop and allowed the water in the lake to drain. Now, the reason that's important is that when it was a lake, it was about 2 meters above where the sea level is now. And glaciers, which sculpted much of the topography we see around us, were retreating to the north. They were melting and retreating. And as they retreated, they left sediment on the ground, and the water carried that sediment into this lake. And the sediment accumulated at the mouths of where the rivers were, and they formed deltas just below the level of the lake surface. And these deltas were sandy gravel plains, about 1.5 meters or 2 meters above where mean sea level is now. And they formed at the mouth of the Connecticut River over here, and the Thames River, and all along lots of little rivers around here. And so all the flat gravel areas you see now around between the hills that form the topography of Connecticut were largely formed 10,000 years ago, and they're kind of flat, right? So when humans from Europe came, that's where they built cities. And many of our bigger cities, like New Haven and Fairfield, they're built first on the flat areas that were low because they were convenient for navigation and for getting water. These green areas here in this map are areas where the USGS has mapped as sandy gravel outcrops that were formed during the end of the last glaciation. Now that's kind of important now because when we get a flood, a big surge from a hurricane like during Sandy, this area is Fairfield, much of it was flooded. And if we increase sea level above where it is now by only like 25 or 50 centimeters, a bit much bigger area will be flooded because it's all flat. Right? So this blue area here is a simulation that we did at Circa last year or 2 years ago of what would Sandy would look like in Fairfield if sea level had been 0.5 meter higher. And you see the area is pretty big. Then the red boundary around the edge is what happens if it was 1 meter higher. So twice as the sea level was change was twice as large, then you got a really small change in the area of flooding. Now, if you live in a red area, I'm sure you care about that, but from a management perspective, you know, once you get 50 centimeters of flooding, of higher sea level, the flood risk increases a lot, but beyond that it doesn't. That's because the hills that were surrounding these flat gravel areas provide us with low protection. In other parts of the country, the topography is pretty flat and it just gets flat for a long ways. And so when you double the mean sea level change from 0.5 meter to 1 meter, the area that gets flooded doubles. In Connecticut, that's not the case, and so we're kind of lucky in some ways. Now, the first thing I did with Circa was I was asked to review what should towns plan for future sea level. And what was available at the time was this figure, which shows several different scenarios. And on the left here is centimeters, right? That's 2 meters. It's about a little bit higher than me. And on this side, let me move to this one. This is a better one because I put feet on this one. I reviewed what happens, what was reported by the government, federal government, and I kind of specialized it for Connecticut. And there's 4 different ways that you can estimate what future sea levels are going to be. And that's what these lines show. And at 2100, they're kind of different, between like 2 and 7 feet, right? And this is sort of what we think now is like the worst case, for 2100. It gets worse after that, by the way, right? This blue is like the best case. This is the upper bound of what's covered. And these 2 intermediate ones are like 4 feet, and those are what scientific models the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have developed. So these represent the scientific consensus of people around the world. But at 2050, they don't really differ all that much, right? And after 2050, they differ a lot. So what I recommended to the state and what was adopted is that towns and the state agencies plan for up to 50 centimeters by 2050. And that's about a little less than 2 feet. And what DEEP is requiring now is, you have 2 feet of freeboard and new properties being built in the flood zone in Connecticut, in anticipation that sea level will be higher in the future. Finally, I just want to make one more point. It's going to continue after that, probably. After 2050, we just don't know how much, for sure. We're less confident how rapidly it's going to change after that for a variety of interesting reasons. So we also, the state has adopted a law which requires the Yukon and the Connecticut DEP update this analysis of data and models at least every 10 years. So that in the event that there's something that we didn't know about, maybe emissions from methane at high latitudes are going to be faster than we currently think, and that's going to lead to more rapid sea level rise. Or maybe they're less when the sea level rise will be less, right? We can update this planning threshold. And finally, the consequence of small changes, this is a really critical point I'll leave you with. 25 centimeters is maybe that much, right? Knee high. It's not that much, but it has a big effect on flooding frequency. And this diagram over here on the right shows sea level associated with storm surges in New London for about 100 years. And you see a blue trend is obviously going upward to the right. That's the signature of sea level rise over the past 100 years. And you see all these big peaks. These are just like the big hurricanes, the ones that are memorable. But there's a lot of small peaks down here. The way the 100-year flood zone is calculated, the level at the 100-year flood zone is calculated is looking at graphics like this. Take data like this, you take the biggest value that occurs in 100 years and you say that's something like what's going to a probability of 1 in 100. Because we know over the last 100 years it's occurred once. So the probability is roughly 1 in 100. The second biggest value has been exceeded twice in 100 years, so its probability is like 1 in 50. The fourth biggest is occurred 4 times in 100 years, so its probability is 1 in 25, right? So that's how this graph is constructed. That's the biggest, the second biggest, the third biggest. You just rank them all down like that, and then you see this nice curve is formed. So if you, specifically at New London, this value, 1.4 meters, is expected to be exceeded on average once every 10 years. If you get 25 centimeters of sea level rise, then the sea level, that storm that caused that would cause higher flooding, right? And so the 25, the level that's flooded every 10 years then would occur every 2 years, right? So what it means is 25 centimeters changes the expectation that you get flooded once every 10 years to once every 2 years. That's a 5 times increase in the risk, and if insurance rates were proportional to the risk, which in the market they would be, your insurance premium would be 5 times higher. So the cost of living by the shoreline is going to go up, right? And there's, look at this data, it's not like a lot of noise in it, right? This is pretty solid. Up here, it's what the big hurricanes do is kind of more uncertain, and how they'll change is more uncertain. But down here, there's not a lot of uncertainty in that. And 25 centimeters is kind of wide, I think, but it could be 50 in 2050, right? And that's the thing that we're going to have to learn to live with and adapt to. And people living along the shoreline, I think, need to understand that it's going to bring costs, and there'll be some changes necessary in how we use the shoreline. Thank you.
So Rebecca French is going to share a little bit about projects in Bridgeport and others.
Thanks to Jim for teaming up the adaptation. So it's going to move us into, from the science of sea level rise and what we understand about that to what are some things we can do about it. Because we're here in a coastal community tonight, so I'm sure you're thinking about these things, particularly after hearing what Jim just said. These are some different coastal resilience strategies. This is a figure by the Army Corps of Engineers, who is from our federal government, the wing that's really largely responsible for large-scale projects for both flooding the coast and in rivers. And so this is looking particularly at the coast. It looks at some upland issues. It's important to have flood warning and evacuation systems. I'm sure you have evacuation routes here in Darien and have signs up indicating where to go to get away from the coast in a hurricane. When you're thinking about homes, you could think about or municipal or state or federal programs, like FEMA has funding for paying for properties that want to move out of the floodplain and then maybe relocating them. Elevating buildings is something we're doing quite a bit in Connecticut. The department I work for, the Connecticut Department of Housing, has a significant amount of funding from disaster recovery they've used to elevate houses all up along the coast. You can also improve drainage. You can improve localized flooding, give places for the water to go. And then you could start building barriers like flood walls or levees. Although if you've been listening to the news, those are not foolproof. You can do shoreline stabilization. So certainly one of the things that happens as sea levels rise and during storms, it increases erosion rates at the shoreline. So you're having more and more area exposed to the action of the water. So that erosion that naturally happens is speeding up. So you might do some localized stabilization, and you can stabilize it in what we say the hard way, using rock, riprap. But that also disrupts natural processes. It's a natural process actually to have erosion for sands to move around. And when you build those hard structures, you're also preventing, you're putting a blockade between the land and the water. So animals that need to be able to move up from the upland into the water and back and forth can't get through them. So you might take a living shoreline approach, where you might conserve a marsh. So one of the things it seems like the Darien Land Trust has marsh properties. That's one of the things you're doing actually is a resilient strategy. It's conserving that marsh. It's a natural barrier to that erosion. You could do some, and then you could do some things where you're doing plantings in areas where, in place of putting in rocks, you can do plantings. You could put a little toe to break up waves. And that's some of what these photos are showing here. You could also, we don't really have big dunes in Connecticut, but like the Cape, those are big dunes. In Connecticut, we have what my colleagues call dunettes. But they do things. They do slow down water. In some of our beach areas, we do have small dunes, so you can restore dunes, make sure they're planted grass so they're stable even when water hits them. And then you can put things out into the water too. Again, kind of frown on big hard structures, but you can actually also create reefs. There's a project in Stratford, Connecticut, where they put in these things they call reef balls. And they essentially are just blocks of cement, but they're shaped in such a way that not only they break up wave action and slow down waves coming to the shore and that erosive force, but they also create nice habitat for the fish and for clams and mussels and all that good stuff that we want to be healthy at our shore alongside us. I was also asked to highlight flood insurance tonight. That's an important issue because in Connecticut, actually, we have a tendency to drop our flood insurance. It's like, hey, my mortgage is paid off. Now I don't have to pay for flood insurance anymore. Well, if you live in the floodplain or if you live even near the floodplain, don't drop your flood insurance. It really is a good strategy for recovery. It can help. And then at the municipal level, this is a program that's becoming, there's some awareness of it, and I understand Darien has taken some steps towards doing this, is joining something called the Community Rating System. This is a program run by FEMA that is available to municipalities that on that scale, the municipality, if you take steps towards lowering your risk, you do more planning, maybe you do some projects like home elevations, like living shorelines, like conservation, that lower your risk as a community-wide, you can actually get a discount on that flood insurance for everybody living in that community. This is a cartoon sort of building on what Jim said. This is what some of those strategies might look like in Connecticut. Again, taking advantage of those natural high points that we have. So here, this is like that natural high ridge line, that naturally resilient area. And in between, like you might elevate homes, have a little dunette, some living shorelines. We build some structures around power plants, things that are really not movable, and they can stay where they are and they cannot get flooded. And again, flood insurance. I don't work for flood insurance, but this is something that but something to think about. That elevation is a good idea. This is a good strategy for individual homeowners who might be sitting here tonight and who might who live in a floodplain, or your neighbors live in floodplains. The FEMA's recommendation for the best is to go actually to the base flood elevation plus 4 feet if you're pretty close to the water. In my Department of Housing, when we fund public housing and it's in a floodplain, the state of Connecticut actually requires us to elevate those homes to the 0.2% annual chance flood, which is called the 500-year flood. It's basically like a worst case scenario. And then to go up another 2 feet above that to account for the 2 feet of sea level rise that Jim talked about that we're expecting or planning for by 2050. But again, flood insurance is a good backup. It can cover up to $250,000, but elevating can save you 60% off the premium. So preventing the flooding in the first place works alongside these recovery programs like insurance to provide you an individual resilience strategy. And Circa actually has a nice white paper about that, so if these slides are available, you can get that PDF, but go to circa.uconn.edu, it's a nice resource on this. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly about Bridgeport. So we took some of those strategies that I talked about in general and applied them here in Bridgeport. This is that natural high point, because this is the flooded area. The blue is the 1% annual chance floodplain or 100-year floodplain. The hatch area is where Sandy flooded. You can see they pretty much map on each other. So Sandy was on par with a 100-year flood. But all the white areas are what's out of the floodplain, and those are those high points. And in between them, the features that Jim was talking about, this is the river, this is the Pequannock. So the areas right around the riverbed, those are low. Yeah, that's because those are those old deltas, it's the low-lying area. Or it was open water and we filled it, and then we built on it. Those are our most vulnerable areas in Connecticut, including Bridgeport. So we did some adaptation strategies. We used Jim's sea level rise projections to say, what do we want to build a coastal flood defense system. We're going to incorporate 2.5 feet of sea level rise in addition to looking at what today's 100-year flood situation is. And this is the reason why. This is the neighborhood that we're working in, is the Bridgeport South End, which is just south of downtown, south of 95 and the rail line. This is Seaside Park, designed by Olmsted, if you've been there. After Irene, full of water. The street just up from that, full of water, Armiston. And this is the Pequannock Power Station, which when they turned it off, the flooding didn't turn the power off, they turned it off as a preventative measure, and therefore thousands of people didn't have power when UI turned that power plant on in 2011. So as Kurt said, the state of Connecticut was fortunate to win a national competition for funding, and it was a total of 54 million, and actually a predecessor competition for that for 10 million called Rebuild by Design. And that sounds like quite a bit of money, but it's actually only about enough money to build a flood wall around a small portion of a neighborhood in the city of Bridgeport. So to give you an idea of the scale of this challenge and put a dollar signs with that, that's what we're talking about at this level of flood protection, trying to keep the water out. What we're doing is we're building a flood barrier wrapping around this side of the neighborhood, connecting up to the rail line here, and then up to the high point. Remember I showed you that high ground, that white area on that early map, that's here. So we connect up into that, and so it brings this whole area out of the floodplain. But then this area is also vulnerable to rainstorms, so we're actually putting in green infrastructure approaches to soak up rainwater, bring it off the streets, and address that regularly occurring chronic flooding issue. And then we also have some funding that we're partnering with Circa to do some regional planning and sort of bring this. So coming to Darien soon will be the Coastal Resilience Plan, Resilient Connecticut Coastal Resilience Plan. So stay tuned for that. And just to give you an idea, I didn't have too many slides about this flood wall structure itself, but this is what something like this looks like. This is a before shot and a coming soon rendering. This is the University of Bridgeport, University Avenue. We're going to elevate it about 16 feet above sea level, which above grade here is about 10 feet up in the air. Elevate the road, and build a flood wall here that we're going to bury so that the students, when they're walking to class, aren't hitting the wall. And that's going to transform this neighborhood. So taking things to this scale for adapting to coastal storms, incorporating sea level rise is a massive effort. But there's many different levels of strategies you can do. So that's what I want to leave you with. There's opportunities to work on this, but it's a big challenge. Thanks.
And David Sutherland from the Nature Conservancy to talk about state strategies.
Right, and I'm going to be PowerPoint abstinent here. I'm not using PowerPoint. So I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and we started getting concerned about sea level rise and coastal storms probably about 12 years ago. And we worked with NASA's Goddard Space Institute to develop our version of a modeling tool that could predict into the future several decades based on different storm scenarios or sea level rise scenarios down to the neighborhood or even street level, which areas, which streets were going to be flooded during different types of storm events, different sea level rise scenarios. And we also overlaid that with demographic information. How many people currently on that street or in that neighborhood are over 65? How many are renters as opposed to owners? What type of community resources do you have there? Hospitals, railroad stations, that sort of thing. And we used that to start going out and talking to different communities, different councils of governments about better planning. And we started hearing feedback from some of those officials about things that were wrong with state laws or things that were preventing them from doing things they felt were necessary because of a deficient state law. And I remember in July 2011, we had a fairly big meeting trying to decide how are we going to get any attention up in Hartford to these issues. People are really feeling them acutely along the coast. How are we going to get anyone to pay attention? And then that year we had Storm Irene. Problem solved. Problem solved. And so the next year, beginning in January 2012, the legislature appointed a sea level rise, a shoreline preservation task force to look at these issues. And there were 16 legislators from both parties, and then there were about 5 or 6 of us who were not legislators. I think Jim's wife was on it, who's a coastal engineer, and had presentations by a wide variety of experts. One of the ones I remember most clearly was a fellow from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they had done various disaster projections, and he showed a slide about one of those huge construction dump trucks. We're not talking an F-150 here, but huge construction dump trucks. And he said, just in Connecticut, if a 1938 hurricane struck Connecticut now, depending on where it hit, it would take to cart away the debris, the building debris, the trees, damaged roadways, it would take 2.5 million truckloads to cart away the debris. It's just one little aspect we might want to think about. Where are we going to have those trucks when the storm hits? So it was a very interesting back and forth, and I think right then the increased awareness that we saw from Storm Irene and then a year later Storm Sandy created quite a few conflicts in terms of what protection methods are the best to use. When we think of the second slide that Rebecca showed with all those different techniques, each of those carries some costs, some benefits, some disadvantages. And part of the challenge we've got here in Connecticut is if you think of our coastline compared to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the New Jersey shore, the Outer Cape, our coastline is much more variable. You've got a rocky outcropping, and then you've got a southeast facing marshland. Then you've got a sandy beach that's facing due south. Then another rocky outcropping. Then a southwest facing tidal marsh. So not only are there different physical conditions, but they're facing different directions and therefore being exposed to different routine currents or wave action. And then depending on which direction the storm hits, they're facing very, very different surge situation or circumstances. So it's really a challenge for coastal engineers here, for the regulators to figure out, is it better to be elevating houses? Should we be using seawalls or other types of coastal armoring? Part of the reason that the Conservancy was concerned about these issues is not only because of the coastal habitats that are going to be submerged and inundated, but we're also concerned about some of the techniques that we're going to want to use to protect properties. Seawalls do a great job in some locations. They're cost effective. In other places, they can actually exacerbate flooding. And in many locations, they can do a lot of damage to natural habitats, such as tidal marshes or tidal flats, that left in a healthy condition, they can actually provide a pretty important buffer to storm surge. So our DEEP, some of our town commissions were faced with trying to help residents make decisions about what are the best techniques to use to protect their property. And so the state passed, coming out of that Shoreline Preservation Task Force, passed a series of legislation in 2012, 2013, and 14 that struck compromises. I left out on the table there a list of some websites that are resources for coastal adaptation, and also a list of some of the legislation that was passed. And a couple of the bills, first of all, established a regulatory preference for living shoreline techniques, what we call softer techniques. Perhaps using structures underwater or softer types of barriers that generally are going to do less damage to natural habitats and leave those in better condition. But it also provided some situations in which armoring or seawalls are going to be permitted. We also passed legislation that requires any new sewage treatment plants for their design to take into account sea level rise. During Storm Sandy, there were a couple of absolute horror stories over on New London of sewage treatment plants that were inundated and were spewing sewage into neighborhoods for weeks after the storm. We came very close here in Fairfield County with a couple of sewage treatment plants. We were very fortunate, but now going forward, any of the designs for new ones have to incorporate sea level rise, and it include things like don't have your electronic controls on the ground floor or up at a higher elevation. You might need seawalls in some cases to protect some of these sewage treatment plants. More recently, this past, in 2018, we passed legislation that updated and incorporated the sea level rise projections for 2050 that Jim's shop developed. And we've incorporated those into legislation now so that state and local plans of conservation and development, hazard mitigation plans, and other planning processes have to take into account and consider those projections and start trying to prepare your communities for those. This legislation also required state-funded buildings to incorporate an extra 2 feet of freeboard. That term freeboard refers to the elevation above your 100-year storm. So if your property is, say, the ground floor is it 3 feet above that elevation, it's gonna, when it's rebuilt or if it's new construction, it's gonna actually have to be the bottom floor is gonna have to be 5 feet above that base flood elevation. So the state is trying to sort of strike compromises between some of those different methods of protection and what's going to work the best, what's going to protect natural resources most effectively. And then most recently, we're trying, including this year, to get some funding for some of the projects that have been developed through the councils of governments, by local municipal governments, some very good engineering firms. Yale University's been involved with designing projects to address local vulnerabilities. We've got a database, and I left a link to it out on the table there. It's 490 projects that have been developed. I think there's 3 from Darien. One at, is it called Pear Point, then Wheat Beach, and then there's another one inland in Darien. And we need money for those. We need some help from the state to help local municipalities start moving forward these and experimenting with these. Again, not all of these projects are going to work because we do have such a variable coast. And we're going to have to experiment, make some mistakes, learn from those, and keep sharing that knowledge across various regions and municipalities. So, as a lobbyist, I'll say, talk to your legislators. If you're concerned about these issues, let them know that the kind of help that you think would be most effective for your municipality. Thank you.
All right, we're going to, I'll ask just a few questions, and then again, Joseph is here. I'm not sure where he is, but if you want to write a question down, he just raised his hand back here. Please just raise your hand. He'll get you a pad for questions. So the first one I'll ask is, Are there maps available to local folks in the audience who want to understand the vulnerabilities that they face from a coastal flooding or sea level rise perspective? Are there resources they can turn to? So that's question number one.
Yeah, there's a few. The state has some good mapping resources, and on that mythical piece of paper I left out on the table out there, there's a link to the Nature Conservancy site, or if you Google coastal resilience, you can find it, and it's that tool is now being used in a lot of other states and even other parts of the world. But you can click on in the United States and Connecticut, and then it's pretty user-friendly. And then I think the state's also got some mapping resources as well. And I put some links to the states, I think to CERCA's website and to DEEP's. DEP's got a very good page that's a lot of different links on it, including some mapping resources.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like just to say that those resources are pretty useful for a general appreciation of the scope of the problem across the state. But because many towns and roads are affected by very small scale structures like tide gates and bridges, that much more detailed analysis needs to go into any plan of action prior to investing. So I think the problem is that the coast is very complex, and there are regions where a large area will be affected by a small tide gate or a small bridge, and other places where these coastal adaptation tools and maps that are available on our websites are useful. But I think that more needs to be done for specific projects.
Okay, thank you. I guess I actually have a question for Rebecca. I think there's an interesting story to be told in West Haven. There's a lot of common, at least, thinking and comments that I've heard about a lot of resistance, which is true in many communities, to the idea of retreat. And there was a very interesting story in West Haven. It's a small 1950s subdivision, ranch houses, very working class neighborhood. And just the experience that they had along this little coastal creek. I don't know if you want to tell that story, Rebecca.
Sure. I don't want to take any credit for what happened there. I've really actually been studying what they did in that community, and actually, as I've heard about it, it was community members themselves who lived in this neighborhood around Oldfield Creek. Is it Sandy Point? I think it's called Sandy Point, right? Yeah. So if you've gone birding, the Audubon owns some property there. Sandy Point's a good birding spot, and that's also where West Haven has a big beach. And just up from that is Oldfield Creek, and the whole neighborhood around that is really built on the marsh that surround the creek. And so that neighborhood flooded in Irene, all the basements flooded, and then flooded again in Sandy. And the homeowners there, who it's a lower income community, they just said, you know what, we don't have the financial resources to keep fixing up our homes. But what can we do? What possibilities are there? So it was a grassroots effort, and I think they went to the town and they went to the DEP, I believe, and then eventually got connected with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which has a program that has buyouts for homes that are part of a contiguous marsh. So it's really a marsh conservation program that they can use to buy out homes to basically expand that marsh. So it's kind of a very particular situation. And they bought out, I think, 32, maybe 36 properties. At this point, I think most of them have been demolished. So if you go to that area now, you won't see very many homes. You basically just see grass. And the marsh may naturally sort of recolonize that area. And, and I don't think the homeowners all wanted to leave. I think they, did like living there, but it became, it didn't become a good situation for them. And I think they found the best option they could that also had this great benefit for the ecology and the environment. And my hope for that city is that they can actually turn that resource into, that it becomes more of an attraction. That people are already coming there for birding, so that it can become a way to actually strengthen other parts of the city that are not as vulnerable. I think that's actually a way forward for some of these municipalities. And I know, because I know their elected officials here, I know they're concerned about grand list and property taxes. So that could be a way. That could be a way. So they did lose some grand lists because of that, but I think it can also be a great resource for that community and a way to bring people in and attract people to coming there and spending time.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
I just mentioned too that I think it's important with all of these issues we're talking about that we're also seeing increased flooding along our rivers inland. And the town of Plainville up near Bristol, they did a similar, I think they bought out about 15 houses there along the Peconic River. And we're seeing with climate change, we're seeing more episodic and more intense storm events generally, or more often. And so that's creating some real problems along some of our riverways. And so a lot of these programs we're talking about also have implications inland as well.
Yeah.
And these are entirely voluntary programs. I really want that no one came in and said you have to leave. These were voluntary efforts that these homeowners said, this is the best option for us. They paid off their mortgages. They got the money they needed to be able to move to higher ground, to safer locations, and so it worked in that situation. Yeah.
I'll just mention another small area that's not fairly analogous, which is Long Beach in Stratford, where there was a small community of summer cottages there that had been rented out by the city. It was no longer viable for a variety of reasons of this, that, and the other thing. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service bought it out, replaced that barrier beach dune system, and it's now a natural system protecting both Stratford and Bridgeport. So I'm going to turn to a couple of questions here. One is there any funding available for applying coastal resiliency strategies like planting living shorelines? And I will probably turn to David. I'll just mention one project. David was involved, Save the Sound was involved, other groups were involved, and did successfully get some dollars available for resiliency. I will say this, I'm going to hold GEP to task. They've done a terrible job of getting that money out the door and getting it allocated and getting it in a real competitive grant system. But there's also some money from the Long Island Sound Study. Anyway, the story I'm going to just mention very briefly is that the city of New Haven was able to attract some of that money, and there's about 3/4 of a mile of a public park, East Shore Park, which is eroding quite badly and is being now redesigned with a shoreline softening effort that's going to bring a marsh ribbon back. It's going to use some small break walls, etc. We helped them through the initial design process. The city of New Haven's now moving for it. And I think one of the things I really want to point out is that right now, if you go down to that shoreline, there's about a 4-foot drop, right? Just a big erosional bank. People can't use that shoreline. It's going to be returning about 3/4 of a mile of shoreline to all levels of people to use. If you go down to East Shore Park, it's an area with active recreation with every imaginable stripe of individual in the world playing either soccer or basketball or whatever, and it's going to return that level of shoreline. So, David, I think we agree, what we really need is a continual source of funding for those kind of projects. I'm going to stop and let you make any comment you want to.
Well, I think part of the problem here is that with our state budget, our ongoing state budget crisis and the reduction in state staff at all of the agencies, including the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, which has lost about 26% of their staff over the last decade. We were able to get some money for them to distribute as grants for these types of projects, but they are already administering more grant programs than they can handle with their existing staff. So I take them to task, but I also understand that they just did not have the staff. So we finally were able to use part of that money and direct it just towards New Haven so that they didn't have to do a lot of administrative work. But so this year, as we're badgering the legislature for some money like this, we're putting in their language that would enable other entities to administer these grants. And I think that's part of the model we're going to have to look at as the state workforce shrinks, is who else can administer grant programs, whether it's for state bonding that we get or if it's federal money in some cases.
Absolutely, and you know, there are nonprofits out there that run regional shoreline projects in Rhode Island and Long Island Sound, et cetera, so that's possible. Okay, here's an interesting one. When and to what extent do you think coastal property values will fall in the face of this kind of thing? And I just want to point out, this is a huge issue for towns, right? Your town services are mostly dependent on grand list, right? So your educational system, et cetera. So it's a really big conundrum, right? And but I'll turn it over to people, and I'll make a comment myself if you're interested. Anybody want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and there is a lot of research going on right now to try and figure out whether, in fact, property values are dropping. Theoretical predictions suggest that it should, because if cost of ownership of one property near the shore is substantially greater than a property nearby and slightly higher, then there's going to be a preference in the market for that property which is got most of the utility, as what economists would call attraction, right? It's like the utility is higher but the cost of operation is lower, then the preference would go to that property. And that would suppress the value of the ones that are expensive. And so I've been looking at data last night even, it's from Connecticut, and I think that there's evidence that the properties in the flood zone in Connecticut are growing less fast than properties nearby that are a little higher. Now, it's clear in some other places in Virginia and in Louisiana that this has happened. And so it's really kind of consistent with what we'd expect to happen. So I think the data is still a little ambiguous because there's a lot of variability in types of property. You know, some houses are bigger, got more bathrooms. They don't sell very often. So doing the statistics is difficult, and drawing conclusions is arguable. But academics, I think, are engaged in this, and my sense is that it's probably going to be clear soon. And I think realtors would argue that the time that market houses are, so this is anecdotal, it's not science, right? Realtors would have told me that the time between sales, how long coastal properties is on the market, is increasing.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I've particularly in my previous role when I was working as director of community engagement at Circa, we're talking to towns about this issue. Did hear that we can't look at buyouts. It's not a viable option for us, to have voluntary buyout program because we're going to lose that property tax, and it's I would go back and think about this challenge and how do I discuss this, and my concern is that the towns aren't planning for that, because whether you want to lose them or not, like the water's coming. So So, and I know that from the science, I know that from talking to Jim, so we have to plan for that. I'm also worried about the grand list, not because of a policy that might encourage buyouts, but because these properties are going to be impacted more and more. So if you want to have an economically resilient coast in Connecticut, you need to think about your future planning and say, well, where's our economic center? Where's our future property value? Where is our town going to go? And those conversations need to happen today so that we're ready for the impacts 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Thank you. Well, is Connecticut considering, maybe this really, I'm slightly changing the question. We talked about West Haven a little bit. It was a managed retreat, voluntary effort. There's been a couple of other locations. Actually, another example was the Quinnipiac. Any of you have ever been to the Quinnipiac State Park? It's called Quinnipiac River State Park. That was an old subdivision and that had flooded repeatedly, and the state bought those properties out. It was probably 40, 50 homes or so. But the question is Connecticut considering policies that would make it easier for neighborhoods to come together and choose managed retreat? My understanding of the West Haven story is that it probably would have been a lot simpler for those folks to have chosen to apply for FEMA money and raise their houses. It was not something they chose to do, but the mechanics of it were perhaps simpler than the policies that were required to allow for a voluntary buyout. So are there things we can do to change policy to encourage communities to grapple and make real choices as opposed to sort of the cookie cutter FEMA, 50%, you gotta raise your house. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. If there's more than 50% damage on your home, then FEMA requires you to bring your house up to above floodplain. Anyway, go either one of you on that.
Well, I'll give the bigger picture first. Back in 2012, we recommended that part of the coastal zone management statutes for Connecticut have a number of sort of guiding principles: access for recreation, maintaining our fisheries, some pretty just lofty big goals. And we propose to add into there for the state to foster over, and this is the exact quote, over a period of several decades, a fair and legal process for strategic retreat from repetitively flood-prone areas. And I've never proposed anything else that's generated as much controversy as that. It was very bitter. And I'm sure some of you probably think it's wait a minute, because if you live on the coast, it's your family, it's your history, it's your memories, it's your life. And so why would you want to think of withdrawing from that or giving that up? I thought this term "over several decades" was kind of moderated. I thought that was reasonable, but it was extremely controversial. I think the following year after Storm Sandy, there's a little more acknowledgement that perhaps we've got to think about that, but it was still that there were still people saying, "You're not talking about strategic retreat, are you?" So I think, frankly, until we have another bad storm, I think there's still going to remain quite a bit of resistance to that. We want to keep that lifestyle that we've developed for some very understandable reasons.
I can comment a bit maybe on federal policy around that. We definitely have some incentives built into our disaster recovery programs. Essentially, the pricing, the way you can use the money, a lot of things point to rebuild exactly the way it was in the same place. And that's how the congressional statutes are written, and that's how the rules, once they went to the executive, have written them. But after Sandy, there were all these programs that said, well, maybe we shouldn't just do rebuilding the same way over and over again. And that's actually what led to that competition that it brought the money to Bridgeport. It's a disaster recovery program, but they said you have to apply for projects up front that recover from the storm. That's why you got the money, was because of the storm. But you have to be forward-looking. You have to incorporate future climate. This is under the Obama administration, by the way. And you can't just do it the way. We're not going to award money for doing it exactly the same way because we know that doesn't work. You have to think about future storms and the past storm. So bringing resilience into our federal policy, into our disaster recovery programs, for all the storms we've had since Sandy, Maria, Harvey, the floods going on in the Midwest, we do need to rethink this at a federal level because the big dollars for these projects right now come through with storms. And I don't want to bore you with why that is, but it has to do with the Stafford Act and that overrides the budget process in Oklahoma. You can talk about that later. But yes, big dollar bouts, big dollars for resilience are really disaster recovery programs as the federal government funds them right now.
Yeah, I'd like to make one comment, and that is about the practicality and costs. Right. So I am confident that the technology and engineering could protect any property that's on the Connecticut shoreline. Absolutely, unequivocally, almost forever. Right. But there's a cost to it, and the cost is different from place to place, and the cost is dollars and cents for construction, and there's a cost and degradation of the environment, which you could turn into cost as well, right? And then the judge, so it's not really a can we do it? It's where, when, and who pays, and what's fair about that cost allocation. And I think it's pretty clear that at the moment that no one in politics is willing to, apart from David, is willing to propose a solution to that, right? Selecting which properties are the ones are going to be protected. Now, to put it in context, those houses in Bridgeport, there may be a couple of hundred, and it's going to cost about $40 million for that project. And so multiply that by a couple of thousand, and that would be protecting some of Connecticut. So it's really not feasible to do everything, and so tough choices are going to have to be made.
One of you asked this question, as a member of the Sustainable Connecticut team, Darien, I've read the Community Resilience Building Workshop programs that are available through the Nature Conservancy, and would Darien benefit from hosting or running a series with, similar to that? It's just an open question.
Yeah, we think it's a really important program, and in fact, our Connecticut staff was hired by the state of Massachusetts to give that program to the coastal communities in Massachusetts. Now, we're all using it. Just a couple of weeks ago, we signed an agreement with Rhode Island, and I think this year 4 communities over there are going to be going through that process. Michigan is starting to use it around their Great Lake areas. So that process, and there are some other good processes out there for doing this type of planning. I think the most important thing is to get your community talking, certainly before the next big storm hits. But as you know, in some areas, just even what we call lunar high tides, 4 or 5 times a year, are creating some now routine flooding that's pretty serious. So I think the important thing is to just choose some mechanism to get as many people in town talking as possible.
I'm going to ask a Long Island Sound-wide question. The city of New York, the Army Corps of Engineers are considering sea barriers, in the very western end of Long Island Sound. Sea barriers that would prevent coastal storm surges from running up into Manhattan and, New York City. So my question really is, what kind of impacts might that have on our area of the Sound? Is there the possibility of refraction of that kind of surge bouncing back and affecting flooding in this western part of the Sound? I don't know if you spent any time even thinking about that.
Yeah, so I have a team at UConn that we've been working on development of simulations for how storms work in Long Island Sound for the last few years. And when I heard about this plan that the Corps of Engineers is considering, I went and read what they were doing, but they haven't paid any attention to what happens in Long Island Sound, really, in their assessment. So as part of a meeting that was held 2 weeks ago, my team did a calculation for what would happen if about half of the cross-section of the East River at Throgs Neck was blocked. And it turns out that I didn't have the design the preliminary design for the gate that they were proposing at that time. That came out a few days later, and the proposal just now is about a blockage of about 38% of the width. And then during storms, it would actually close and be 100% blockage. So, but the 38% would be blocked all the time, right? So what we did is an assessment of what that would do to sea level and Long Island Sound. And it's actually quite an interesting result that the amplitude of the principal tide, sea level variation, how much it goes up and down, is going to be reduced, we think, by about 25 centimeters over much of Long Island Sound. So that what that would do, it would knock about 25 centimeters off the storm surge during a big hurricane. We haven't done any further simulations because I only had about a week and a half to do these ones. But I did harass the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to pay more attention to Long Island Sound because there will be environmental impacts all across the Sound that will affect how marshes work. And it might be that there is some advantage to Connecticut to be had by this gate. It might, if it reduces the tide, the total water level during a storm might reduce. But it really needs to be studied very carefully, and it takes a year of effort from my team rather than a week.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. There's a question about. I think this is basically a question: is it possible that we could experience a truly seismic sea level rise event in the next, say, 50 to 100 years? And I think they're probably, I'm just interpreting the question might be about, massive ice shelf loss in the Antarctic area, et cetera, and what kind of impact that might have. So I'm kind of interpreting in here because it's a little bit of a...
The question was earthquake.
Oh,
earthquake.
like
Oh, okay.
tsunami?
Hudson River
Okay.
has a rift, and East Long Island, the same thing.
Yeah.
That was the
All right.
idea.
So earthquake question. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, so not that I'm aware of. I think there's obviously, never say never, but the risk of that is very low. I think, the risk the same is true with Kurt's question. The real horror movie kind of scenarios are more likely more than a century from now. The simulations which suggest maybe 5 meters of sea level rise, they would take several hundred years to occur. It's pretty straightforward to estimate how much heat is required to melt ice, right? And so we know how much heat is coming from the sun, and we know how much CO2 emissions we're putting into the atmosphere. So we can estimate the rate of additional heating that the poles would get. And that's how we make these sea level measurement estimates that I showed you. So it would have to, some radical process would have to be discovered which we didn't know about in order to accommodate a really absurd sea level rise. But at 2300, if we continue burning CO2 the rates we do, we could have huge sea level increases in Connecticut. Much of Connecticut would be flooded. What we know just now would be flooded.
I don't, if you were talking about, I'm going to venture here into an area I know nothing about, but I think there was talk several years ago about an island off of Portugal or Africa that they were concerned, was it for volcanic activity, that if it were to erupt, that part of that island could fall into the water and send a tsunami across the Atlantic. But I've just given all that I know about that scenario. So go home worried about that.
I mean, I think, it's like, what do you want to plan for, and what do what kind of risk? So, for example, the nuclear power plant in Waterford has to plan for, like a 1 million chance, 1 in a million chance storm event, because there is no risk of flooding to that plant that is acceptable at all because of the implications, right? But if we were to plan for that level of flooding and the flood wall, the flood barrier I'm trying to build around Bridgeport, if I was planning for that kind of a scenario, I'd be building, something the height of a skyscraper around the side of Bridgeport, which is be completely infeasible and astronomically expensive. So, when you're thinking about the kind of risk, there's always a risk that you can't adapt to, which is why you need to have evacuation routes. Why resilience is about actually having a lot of ways to deal with different scenarios. Not everything is about building in place or planning. Some of it's about getting the heck out of the way, public safety, just, there's a lot of ways to deal with those kind of situations.
I think I'm going to ask one last question from the audience, which is sort of an interesting one. Suggestions for re-repairing a driveway on the water's edge. This happens to be in Ash Creek, Black Rock area. So it's kind of like a very practical question. Someone who has a driveway down near the coast area, and suggestions on what to do to repair, replace it.
I would go for permeable pavers, something permeable. So I'm thinking a lot about, if we're talking about if you want to repair your driveway in a resilient way. Don't just put down blacktop again that the water runs off it and then takes the chemicals off it every time it rains. Put things on that the water could soak through. So permeable pavers way to that. Or if you're going to put down blacktop again, you can slope your driveway in such a way so that the rainwater maybe goes into your yard as opposed to into the sewer. And in Black Rock, I think that's not sewer separated. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure which is sewer separated and which isn't. This is different Black Rock. There are multiple Black Rocks. Sorry. Yeah. So.
Right. This is.
Yeah. So, but that's Bridgeport. Okay. Sorry about yeah. So that area is definitely not sewer separated. So you don't want to put more storm water into that system. So you want to. Yeah, you want to do what you can to keep the storm water out of the sewer system, infiltrate into the soil, or ramp your driveway in such a way that the water flows into your yard or into some green space.
Thank you. Well, thank you, audience, for some great questions. I've been asked just to speak and kind of wrap things up for 4 or 5 minutes, and hopefully take what is a pretty depressing and difficult issue and talk a little bit about some hope. We have done amazing things in this state. I don't think you probably may not realize this, but we are one of the only states in the country that decided when the federal government stopped investing in sewage treatment plants and in sewering back in sort of the 70s when we had huge sewage issues. We decided as the state of Connecticut that these were waters of the state, and there was a major infusion of investment in that infrastructure. We did it for about 35 years. We've upgraded every sewage treatment plant around Connecticut and in New York. And we just released a report card, which is out there, which shows that the waters out here have improved dramatically. We've sort of forgotten about the power of collective action. We're living in a time when things are very fractured and it's very easy to be depressed. We're now facing really different kinds of threats than we did in 1970. In 1979, when the state invested in waters of the state, we still have to be thinking about, this is a photo from the Merritt Parkway on September 25th, 2018. There was 4 inches to 8 inches of rain that ran all through the Merritt area. This is a poor gentleman coming to his car in a park and ride lot on the Merritt. And in Hamden, Connecticut, this is probably Hamden, there was 8 inches of rain that landed within a 3.5-hour period. What rain problems are all about is how quickly they come and how much. If this had been over 4 days, there wouldn't have been a problem. But this is one of those situations where you're saying, honey, I lost the car. So what do we do about these problems, right? So creating resilient communities is something that we can do through a variety of different techniques we talked about. But a $20 million fund, which you might say is a lot of money, let me tell you something about what the state's been spending on sewage upgrades. We've spent about $100 million on average for grants to cities to improve their systems over the last 25 years. So $20 million is something that a state like us can do, okay? And what we could do with that, if it's repeated, is we could get 1 billion gallons of this kind of storm water that Rebecca was just talking about back into the ground. It's going to not only stop flooding, but it's going to clean up, your rivers. It's going to prevent flooding. It's going to help return habitat, and we can do it through simple things like this, which is rain gardens. All of the rain coming off can go into these sunken little areas. The beautiful advantage of it is that anybody of any age can get involved. We started doing about a half a dozen of them in New Haven with these kids at Troop School. And what happened was then the city of New Haven, we worked with them on a feasibility study. They got excited. They wanted to make it a practice. And there was work that David did with us and many others up at the state. Got some funding aside. Again, frankly, DP couldn't get out of his own way, couldn't get the money out on the street. We're going to change that. You need to help us with that. You got to let the commissioner know, if you get some damn money, figure out how to spend it. Like, we're hurting here, people. This is just as important as what we did when we had the problem of sewage all over the Sound, right? It's just as important. It's not acceptable not to do it. Anyway, Marty Looney, the Speaker of the House, Majority Leader, got money in. This has moved from 6 or 8 projects, and now there's 200 of these happening in the city of New Haven. We're going to have 88 million gallons of water back into the ground, right? We can do this. You've got to believe in yourself. We have the power to do it. I couldn't agree more with what Rebecca was saying, what you were saying about needing to do this on a town level, right? Our little town of Branford, we're kind of a pathetic little group, right? But let me tell you the story. Really interesting. We did our new plan of conservation and development, right? You've all heard of that. A bunch of people got together. I was shocked. I didn't do any lobbying at all. I just showed up. And there's like 80 people talking about coastal resiliency. We got to take care of flooding, etc. So out of that, I got up and said, hey, you know what, guys? We actually can't just have this part of the plan. We got to have a capital project, right, for your town. Put some money aside, right? Put some money aside. They now have $1 million resiliency fund. It's just a start. It's not going to do everything, but it might take care of 2 or 3 of the highest level projects, right? We've got to keep it. We got to keep it happening. This is a group of kids down in Bridgeport at the Beardsley Zoo. Putting in rain gardens to protect the Pequannock River, right, where they show up every afternoon. We've got to believe in ourselves. We've got to believe in these kids. We've got to make it happen. So here's, a little story about rivers. This is 6 feet of an old rotten dam upriver from Westville. I don't know anybody been to New Haven. Westville's that little neighborhood on the west side, but very urbanized, right? if this was a dam built in about 1730, hasn't been maintained. If it were to let loose, it would bring 6 feet of slime and muck down into Westville, right? Next time we have one of those projects, it might have happened. We took the dam down, right? And this is what we're seeing now. The river's alive again. The fish are coming up again. We're protecting Westville from floods. You see those houses on the right way up there? Well, the water level's now 5 feet lower for those houses. They used to flood every spring. That's what resilience is about, right? Yeah, this was $1 million project. It cost some money, right? But David is great. He'll get us the money up at the state capitol. He'll tell Katie Dykes to get the hell out of the way and spend it, right? And you'll get your town of Darien to come up with plans and make it happen. So, you know, the last thing I'll just say is that our little state of Connecticut now has this plan for climate action for 2023. It's actually in law to reduce levels to the same extent that the United Nations people are telling the best scientists in the world are saying we must do for survival. Again, we have to let the city, the state of Connecticut know, the DEP, etc., that they have to have a plan, we have to hold them to account, we have to make it happen. So, my final word is believe in yourselves. You can make it happen here, folks. You've done it before, right? You brought Long Island Sound from a sewage-filled S-hole to, now coming back to life. We can do the same thing here. So thank you very much. I do apologize that you couldn't stand up and ask your questions, so sorry about that. But thank you to them. Another round of applause.